moment to see that down there every day out, and had to come and see that park statue in this park and be reminded of the racial hatred. It is just, it's God.
They're coming down. Oppressor man, oppressor woman, cut yourself free of the rank and rancid past. Rinse your garments in the sweet, new fragrance of truth, integrity, accountability, and grace. Make room for a bright and beautiful tomorrow. Rinse your garments in the sweet, new fragrance of truth, integrity, accountability, and grace. Make room for a bright and beautiful tomorrow.
Following shooting, South Carolina removes the Confederate flag from the grounds of the state capitol.
If we really want to move forward, instead of adding statues of people who cause so much atrocities and celebrate them at the same point, at the same time, it just says that you're contradictory in what America actually stands for.
Good afternoon. I am Philip Carter. I'm the director of the Center for Humanities in an Urban Environment at Florida International University here in Miami. And I want to start by telling you a little bit about where I'm currently seated. This is my office. I'm in a neighborhood in Miami called Coconut Grove. And I know there are a lot of people on this call who don't live in Miami. So I wanted to tell you a little bit about the neighborhood. Coconut Grove is a lush tropical part of Miami. It's just south of downtown Miami, and it's east of Coral Gables, if that means anything to you. The office where I'm seated right now overlooks a street called McFarland Avenue that runs up against another street right there that I can see through the window called Grand Avenue, and then around the corner is Main Highway. A lot of the streets around here are named for the lush tropical environment: Avocado Street, Loquat, Kumquat, Leafy Way. If you walk around the neighborhood, including in the Central Grove, where I am right now and where most of the shops and restaurants are located, you'd hardly know that Coconut Grove is the oldest permanent settlement in Miami-Dade County, or that it was settled primarily by Bahamians, save for a handful of streets: Abaco Avenue, Inagua Avenue, and Lucaya Street, so named for Abaco Island, the Inagua Islands, and the Lucaya Archipelago, all parts of the Bahamas. If I leave Coconut Grove to head into Coral Gables, the next neighborhood over, I take what the locals call in English Ponce, named for Juan Ponce de Leon, whose famed search for gold led him to Florida and then Puerto Rico, where he was governor. It's pretty easy to tell the origins of the place names in and around Coral Gables: Segovia, Sevilla, Valencia, Malaga, Alhambra, Menorca, Mallorca, Salamanca, Spain. Walking around beautiful Coral Gables, you wouldn't know that before Ponce de Leon got there, the land was inhabited for some 2,000 years by the Tequesta, the largest Native American group in southeastern Florida. And in fact, you probably wouldn't know that from driving around anywhere in Miami unless you happen to cross Brickell Avenue Bridge, where you may or may not catch the statue to the Tequesta Warrior, which, by the way, happens to look out over the Biscayne Bay, which was once called Tequesta Bay, then renamed by the British Dartmouth Sound, then renamed Bahia Vizcaína in Spanish, and then anglicized as Biscayne Bay. I need not tell you the fate of the Tequesta in Florida for you to know what happened to them, or to the Taínos, a group that may or may not have been related to the Tequesta, who lived in and around the Caribbean in places such as present-day Cuba and Puerto Rico, where Ponce de Leon, whose street is right down the way, was governor. The purpose of this linguistic archaeology was to make 2 points by way of introduction to this event, Monumental. First, all places are historical. There is no ahistorical place. All places reflect the power dynamics of history, imbued as they are with the dynamics of colonialism, capitalism, race, and empire, and the names and symbols, including the flags, statues, and monuments that inhabit our cultural spaces. They're not simply neutral reflections of what happened, but rather deliberate decisions made by individuals, groups, and societies about what histories will be told, in what languages, for whom, by whom, and with what materials. Second, all of us can perform the exact same archaeology that I just did of my neighborhood in the places we live and work, including, by the way, on our university campuses. And we can ask questions about the space that we inhabit. Is this space just? Who is this made for? Whose aesthetics, values, and history is being reflected, told, and reproduced? Whose power is being maintained? And that is the theme for today's event. For the next 90 minutes, we'll be thinking about race, history, and power in the context of public spaces. Thank you for joining us for Monumental, Flags, Statues, and the Politics of Public Space. We're going to move to our first speaker. Andrea Quili is Associate Professor of Anthropology in the Department of Global and Sociocultural Studies here at Florida International University. The title of her talk is Monuments in the Wake. Andrea?
Hi, thank you so much, Philip. Thanks for the invitation, and to Tempest for putting on an extraordinary webinar once again. So you all are amazing. So I'm going to get right into it. I need to share my screen here. Let's see. All right. Okay, can everybody see that? Yep, okay, great. So this presentation basically represents the beginnings of my thinking through some ideas tossed around during a WLRN, which is, for those of you not in Florida, or South Florida, the public radio station here. This panel that I was on a few weeks ago, and the subject of the panel was monuments, right? Not only to the Confederacy, but also to the conquistadores, the Spanish conquistadores and the Spanish presence in Florida. And this discussion, as well as informal exchanges that I had with listeners afterwards, brought to the fore some of the key ideas I'm exploring today. And one question that really brought to me what I'd like to talk through has to do with what's the fate of the monuments, right? So, some of them have been brought down, defaced, and otherwise targeted as particularly energized sites of the so-called racial reckoning that we're experiencing, but what will come of them, right? And this question leads to others, such as those concerning the relationship between past and present, the production of history, and what I focus on today, what might be the role of these monuments in the endeavor to come to terms with, to seek resolution around, and somehow put a stop to what Associate Professor of English Christina Sharp refers to as the quotidian disasters that characterize the afterlife of slavery and are illustrated by numerous social, juridical, economic realities, but perhaps most poignantly by the normativity of Black death. Indeed, I consider the monuments to the Confederacy as an example of these quotidian disasters, in part because they are themselves symbolic of the normativity of Black death. And in thinking through the past, present, and future of the monuments, I draw upon Sharp's 2016 book publication, In the Wake, which is where the title comes from, the title of my presentation. So her book is called In the Wake on Blackness and Being. And it kind of provides this framework for understanding the meanings of the monuments and the possibilities for imagining the role that they, as afterlives of property, might play in a paradigmatic shift in consciousness around anti-Blackness in particular. And so essentially, she looks at these these different definitions of wake, right? And she uses the wake as a metaphor for the temporal, spatial, and psychic realities that have both followed and live within chattel slavery, within the shadow of chattel slavery, in the present of chattel slavery. And so the ways that she's thinking about the wake or defining the wake are the idea, which is of course a very powerful image and metaphor of the wake that's left in the surface, the water surface by a ship, and it's resonant of course the transatlantic slave trade and the ships that were used to transport enslaved Africans to the Americas. And then also, when you think about the wake being woke, right, as the young folks say, the state of wakefulness or consciousness as one interpretation of wake, or waking up, and then also a wake. So the vigil that we engage in at the bedside of somebody who has passed away, and oftentimes a wake involves this rituals and observances of eating and drinking, as I say here, and partying, and depending on where you're from, there are lots of things that can happen in wakes, and then also the line of recoil of a gun, right? So that evokes this violence, destruction, and so she also talks about this slavery's afterlife, right? And says, that we're essentially, and she's again looking at this question of history, and that we're really in the room with history, and that it's ever present, right? And that part of being in the room with the particular histories that we have is really being in a state of emergency, right? In an undeclared, silenced state of emergency. And as she notes, so to be in the wake is to be occupied by this continuous and changing presence of slavery's as yet unresolved unfolding, right? And so we can of course think about what are the elements of and evidence of the, as she calls them, the precarities of the afterlives of slavery. I think here, we have, yes, limited life, skewed life chances, limited access to health and education, premature death, incarceration, impoverishment, et cetera, right? And as I said, an ever-present reality of the wake is the normativity of Black death, right? And the normativity of Black death as essential, right? Not outside of or in contradiction with this democracy, but is essential to this democracy, right? And for some reason, slide, there we go. And so this is one, you all might have seen this. One kind of image that I think is particularly evocative, because this is one of the survivors of the 1963 church bombing in Birmingham, Alabama. So Sarah Collins Rudolph, and her sister was actually one of the children who the girls was murdered. And so she's standing in front of this monument that, was 115 years old, Confederate monument, and that was removed in June. And it's actually around the corner from where the bombing took place, right? And I see this really as an example of living in the wake. What does it mean, as you see spray painted on this pedestal, what does it mean to say that Breonna was here, right? And I interpret that as both an assertion that the young Black woman murdered by the police lives through these acts of defiance, and that we can imagine this as her wake, that the defacing and dethroning of this monument and perhaps others is a ritual of observance while standing vigil beside the dead. And hold on, sorry about that. Here, let me just use this here. Okay, and this, if we look at this one, this is a kind of another kind of vigil, right? We have the police kind of standing dispassionately over the body of Jefferson Davis, right? This symbol of the body of Jefferson Davis that was also pulled down in June in Richmond. And then, this one, I think, what does it mean to scrawl in red that these Confederate soldiers were racist, right? So declaring in blood red that these Confederate soldiers were racist is this evidence of both the track in the water that slavery and the Civil War left behind, and the awakening or coming to consciousness of those who made this declaration. And here, I'm sure you all are familiar with these images, right? The coming down of the statue of Edward Coulson in Bristol. And so these protesters are sending him to his watery grave, which I believe he was rescued from. And perhaps seeking symbolically to bury him and bury the statue and what he represents, but also the ways in which Bristol has denied ignored, and lionized the trade, the slave trade, right? Thereby interrupting their act, thereby interrupting the quotidian disaster that passing by Coulson statues every day enacts. And we saw from the video that was playing in the beginning, the woman's, saying that this was God, that, having to pass by these statues of the Confederacy, having them come down was incredibly powerful, really powerful moment. So Sharp also talks about surviving slavery's afterlife, right? So what is the solution to this enduring anti-Blackness, to Black exclusion, Black objection, right? And she posits that rather than seek resolution through projects like assimilation and diversity, inclusion, human and civil rights discourse, that she's really looking at literature and visual culture and performance and how they mediate survival in the face of the quotidian disasters, arguing that Black expressive culture isn't really seeking resolution, but is a space in which the paradoxes of Blackness, the illogic of being a human who is ontologically denied humanity, are represented. And Philip, if you can play the video clip. Done.
Can you unshare your screen, Andrea?
Sure.
You about to lose your job. You about to lose your job. Get this dance. You about to lose your job because you are detaining me for nothing. You about to lose your job. You about to lose your job. Get this dance. You about to lose your job. Oh my goodness. You about to lose your job. Get this dance. You about to lose your job. Get this dance. You about to lose your job because you are detaining me for nothing. You about to lose your job. Get this dance. You about to lose your job. Get this dance. You about to lose your job because you are detaining me for nothing. You about to lose your job. Get this dance. You about to lose your job. Get this dance. You about to lose your job. Get this dance. You about to lose your job. You about to lose your job. Get this dance. You about to lose your job. Get this dance. You about to lose your job. Is this shit worth you losing your job? Cause you about to. Cause you ain't got no reason.
Thank you. All right. So what's the role of Black expressive culture, right? So in this remix, you see the woman's spontaneous performance that went viral actually back in June and inspired this remix, illustrates the representation of the paradoxes of Blackness to which Sharp refers. We are celebrating the fact that the officers who murdered George Floyd were fired, that the punishment for murdering a Black man in broad daylight is to lose your job. That is considered a win. At the same time, the clip reveals another layer of paradox, which you may not have been able to see, I'm not sure, because if you watch the entire clip of her, you see that the arresting officer, who looks like he's Black, he can barely suppress his laughter at his detainee's performance, right? And so he too is surviving slavery's afterlife and aftermath. So back to the monuments, right? So I'll end with this. Yes, I'm wrapping up, Philip. I know I'm a little bit over time. So I want to end with these images of the pedestals. As to me, they're such a powerful visual that is an invitation to create and perhaps a response to Sharp's question, right? How does one memorialize chattel slavery and its afterlives, which are still unfolding? How does one memorialize the everyday? And we see that we're kind of faced, I think, and tasked with imagining the potential of transformation that these monuments and their pedestals and there's these spaces that they've occupied offer us, and what do they symbolize? And we have to ask, what might live in the afterlives of these monuments? Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Andrea. A reminder to the viewers, we're gonna have questions at the very end of this, so hold your questions until the end. Now we're going to move to Alan Jyn. Alan Jyn, photojournalist, was born and raised in New York City's Chinatown. Since 1996, he's worked in China, the former Yugoslavia, Afghanistan, Egypt, Iraq, Central Asia, and Ukraine, as well as extensively in the United States. He's a contributing photographer to many publications and a professor at the New School in Columbia University and CUNY Graduate Schools of Journalism. And his work is in the collections of the Museum of Modern Art and the Detroit Institute of Art. Today, his presentation is entitled Photographing 1968 in 2020, Symbolic and Real Conflict. Alan?
Thank you so much, Philip and Tempest, for all your work putting this together. So I'm just going to dive into it. I'm going to share my screen, and I'm just going to talk as I show you all this slideshow. This is basically work from the last few months. And so I'll hit it. And basically, we can't really talk about, you know, I really like what Professor Quili just said about, hang on, can you guys see the stuff at the bottom or no?
Alan, we can't see your screen yet. It just says slideshow settings.
Oh, really? Okay, let me try this again. I'm sorry. Because we had it working before, didn't we? So let me share screen. Here we go, share. And now we are gonna do slideshow. And now, is that working?
That's working.
Great. So I really like what Professor Quili just said about history is in the room. And 1968, you know, is this moment in American history. Remember when we crossed the number of dead in Vietnam with the number of dead in this pandemic. So really, we can't look at these monuments and these protests out of that context. This are the Black Panthers on the steps of the Olympia, Washington State Capitol building in 1968. And of course, we go from that, a direct line, into the protests now. So of course, I started shooting the pandemic. You saw some images from a funeral home there, documenting that cost. And then once the action kind of exploded on the streets of major American cities, and you can see here some of this direct, you know, pepper spray. This is what happens when you get pepper spray. This is what happens when the police are hit by bricks and rocks. And this first section is on Brooklyn, New York. An arrest happening. And on the left, it's blurry, but you can see the cameras, right? So just as in other historic moments, we photographers and journalists are out there documenting this. Sometimes we become the victims too. But most of the time, I'm glad to say, we can do our jobs as best we can. And looking at all these moments, here's one of 20 police cars that was burned in one night in New York City. And that's where, just as in 1968, and here's a protester who was beaten, had to receive many stitches. The line between symbolic and real violence in some ways has been crossed, right? When police cars are burning, when people have real injuries, it's no longer symbolic in the sense of wanting to impact the larger conversation. It's, you know, a real tactical impact to people, most importantly, but also to physical things, right? Windows being broken, literally. And as a photographer and chronicler, really aware of that history, I've been thinking about that a lot as I shoot these images. So this whole first section, yeah, say his name, which you saw a lot. Then I started traveling across the country because I realized, just like in 1968, it wasn't just in one place. Now we're looking at Tulsa, Oklahoma, where the Trump supporters thought it would be crowded, so they actually camped out on the streets. As we know, it didn't turn out to be crowded at all, but they didn't know that. And so it wasn't a protest per se, but it was a public gathering, as you can see, of many thousands of unmasked people on the streets of Tulsa, while Trump spoke inside the arena. And this is actually where he was supposed to come out and in fact didn't because there was no real overflow. And just as the Black Lives Matter protesters carry signs, so do the Trump supporters, right? You can see who's supporting what, kind of based on some of their signs, but even based on what clothes they're wearing. You know, even if we took away the words and the bumper stickers, you know, and the actual text, you know, you could probably guess most of the time who is supporting what side. And that is that's stereotyping. It really is, and that's unfair. But nonetheless, I think if you look at even a very large number of pictures of what's been happening, you could probably make that guess fairly accurately. Here are the police in Tulsa. Those were the counter protesters in this case, right? Anti-Trump protesters. It was amazing to see the police and the National Guard here actually pull back without confrontation and without violence. It was a de-escalation, something we are actually beginning to see in some cities, at least, not all. And because the theme here is monuments, I wanted to show you Appomattox, because this is where the Civil War ended. These are the very last Confederate soldiers killed in the Civil War. Note how well this is maintained. The state of Virginia spends money every year to maintain this. And this is the context. This is the historic Black cemetery in Richmond, which has never been maintained and is only kept going by volunteers, and they receive no money from the state. So I think it's really important to understand that context. Down to Jackson, Mississippi, where, as you know, there was a big controversy over the Confederate flag still being part of the state flag, and inside the State House, as they voted to remove the Confederate emblem from the flag, some of the legislators brought their children because they realized it would be a historic moment for them. And of course, they did it with as much pomp and dignity and circumstance as they could muster to a small crowd. This wasn't really publicized, but word got out, and so some people at least, did gather to see that flag come down officially for the last time in Jackson. And then, of course, we moved to Richmond. We just saw in the previous slideshow many monuments. And this, of course, is what Robert E. Lee now looks like. It's become a circle of community organizing, of protest, but also of musical performances and dance performances, and just, you know, sitting in an outdoor space and socializing, and you know, all this goes on. These are some of the pedestals where the statues were removed from. And it's kind of amazing to see this. This is where Stonewall Jackson was. And you notice at the bottom, it says, "Don't stop here." And of course, racist traitor. And of course, this is Robert E. Lee with those nightly projections that now happen on that statue. Really powerful images. This is the counter culture, if you will, the Rumors of War statue. This represents a native figure on a horse instead of a Confederate general. Down to Mount Bayou, a town in Mississippi founded by formerly enslaved people 133 years ago, and they celebrate that anniversary every year on what's called Founders Day, where they visit the graves of the founders. But it is also a kind of protest. And the town itself is a monument, you could say. On to Atlanta, Georgia, where there was amazing spontaneous mourning that broke out as when Congressman John Lewis died of cancer at the age of 80, and Georgia's 5th district. Again, you see echoes of 1968, "I am a man." This is a famous sign from the Memphis sanitation workers' strike, which was Martin Luther King's last campaign before he was murdered. And this too, of course, overlaps and turns into a form of protest. Portland, Oregon, where about almost 100 homeless people camped out on the streets of City Hall for almost 3 weeks. And there, in the end, there was threats of a police crackdown, but in the end, it was resolved peacefully. Finally, Louisville, Kentucky, where many hundreds of the NFAC, Not Fucking Around coalition of Black gun activists gathered to protest the killing of Breonna Taylor by the Louisville police. And as you can see, they first got notice on July 4th when they gathered in Stone Mountain, Georgia, where the large Confederate carving is, and then they came to Louisville, Kentucky, on a very hot day. So that previous picture was taking care of people with heat exhaustion. And then they marched through the streets of Louisville. There were white gun groups, such as the 3 Percenters, but there were no clashes. And remember that picture I showed you of the Black Panthers in Olympia, Washington. And this is 2020. That's it.
Thank you so much, Alan. I know that we're going to have a lot of questions for you from viewers about this work. Next, we're going to move to Jyn Reed, who's joining us from Bristol, England. At the peak of the global Black Lives Matter protests sparked by the death of American citizen George Floyd on 7th June 2020, during a Black Lives Matter protest, the city of Bristol reached the headlines across the world after the statue of Bristol-born merchant and slave trader Edward Coulson, which we've actually seen a couple of times today already, was toppled, dragged, and thrown into the harbor. Jyn Reed was there the day that took place, hopped up onto the pedestal, raised her hand, was photographed, and was cast as a statue by artist Mark Quinn, who created a surge of power. And Jyn Reed is with us today from Bristol. Jyn?
Sorry, hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you fine, thanks.
So I was actually there on the day of the march. Obviously, you know, COVID was everywhere, is everywhere that day. So I was very torn as to whether I should attend, because I look after my elderly parents. But for me, it was something that I was compelled to do, that I had to do. So after much deliberation in the morning, I took to the streets along with 10,000 other people in Bristol to protest against the killing of George Floyd and for many other Black people who have died at the hands of the police and have faced injustices. On my way to the march, what I did actually notice hanging from the trees were 3 ropes. I saw it and it just kind of left my mind, but obviously now with hindsight, I just do remember seeing the ropes hanging from the trees. We made our way up to where the speakers were making their speeches, which were great speeches, and we all knelt for 8 minutes, remembering George Floyd. I remember kneeling and the tears just flowing down my face. It was quite emotional. I've not watched the video myself, I don't intend to. But just kneeling there for 8 minutes, you just realize how long that actually is, and that man knowing that he was going to die at the hands of the police and him calling out for his mother. So we left the speeches and we made our way to the park, to a nearby park where it was going to march through the town. I decided, along with my husband, that we were going to take a shortcut. We're going to take a short route just to avoid the crowds. When we arrived at the park and we saw the protesters coming in, we received a message from a friend showing us that Edward Coulson had been toppled. So we forgot our plans about going home because I really wanted to take a picture or see Edward Coulson on the floor. You know, this is the man I used to work opposite, facing that slave trade on a daily basis. For many years, we have protested and signed petitions for that statue to come down. Fell on deaf ears. So obviously somebody had taken it into their own hands and toppled him. So on arriving there, there was lots of kids there, lots of cheers from the crowds. I took several pictures with Coulson myself. He had painted face, afro pick on his head, and a box of Jamaican jam and juice. And the crowds were going crazy. And then before I knew it, 5 guys started rolling the statues, very heavy, very tinny on the ground. I then saw my husband and he had joined in, and we rolled, they were just rolling and rolling. Halfway through it stopped, and my husband, the same ropes that took Coulson down, tied one to his neck and the other to the bottom, to his foot, and we dragged him to the river. Crowds were going crazy, but all at this time, everything was in a way still peaceful. There was no trouble. You know, the police did not intervene, and they made a point of not intervening. And one chief constable actually said that he understood and just thought it best that his men are not involved and to let people doing what they're doing. And he totally understood why they were doing that. So soon after leaving there, obviously full of adrenaline, and realizing that we made history, or my husband made history along with the few other men, we were walking toward the plinth. When you walk to the plinth, all the placards that were around the plinth, people had just left them there. And I just felt compelled to take the plinth. I obviously tried on several times, but I couldn't get up there because it's pretty high. I stood on my husband's shoulders and took to the plinth and raised my fist. Even thinking about it now, it really does give me goosebumps, because knowing what that man stands for and how long he was there for. So, you know, like I said, when I raised my fist, I raised my fist for the people that he enslaved, for the same people that he threw in the same river where he was thrown. For my daughter, for George Floyd, for all the Black people who have suffered injustices at the hands of, for being Black, really, because it would appear that it's kind of illegal being Black, especially in America. I raised my fist for all the people, Black people that have suffered injustices. So yeah, it was a real empowering moment. It was very impulsive. It wasn't planned. It was just very spontaneous. Obviously, I dressed as a Black Panther because, as far as I'm concerned, we still may as well be in the 60s, because that's where we are now, and nothing has changed really. So obviously, you know, that along with me raising my fist on the plinth, and my husband took a picture. The picture was quite a breathtaking one. I obviously didn't realize at the time. I knew people were taking pictures because I had to turn around for the people behind me to take pictures as well. But after getting down and seeing my husband's picture, it really did take my breath away, because it just set the whole tone and the mood with the clouds and my silhouette and me raising a fist. It was quite breathtaking. So he then posted that on his social media the next day, sorry, that same night. And we were obviously receiving calls from friends saying, oh my God, Al's on the news, because he had given a TV interview immediately after throwing Coulson in the river. So there was lots of phone calls coming in. And then mid-morning, I received a call from my husband saying that Mark Quinn was trying to get hold of me because he wanted to work with me in some way, somehow. He then called and said, hey, look, I want to make a statue. I want to do a statue of you. And I was obviously very surprised, but then I just thought, let's do this, because obviously it's something that would keep the conversation going. It's something that would bring Black Lives Matter to the forefront and make people continue the talk and to make a stand. You know, as far as I'm concerned, me standing on that plinth was a cleansing of the plinth. So, you know, it would be Jyn Reed or a Black woman taken to that plinth. So yeah, so it was something that we didn't hesitate to do, and it's something that I do. It's something that I would do again, and it obviously has brought awareness. Obviously, it only stayed for 24 hours. You know, some might argue that it should have stayed there for longer. I wish it had, for people who hadn't seen it. However, I think it brought a lot more attention, it being there for 24 hours, rather than you know, rather than the week that it was there. Sorry, I'm just looking through the questions you have. So yeah, so what do I think should happen with statues? The statues that represent slave masters, I think they have a rightful place in a museum, so that the full story can be told as to who they are and why they're there, because obviously only half a story is ever told. So that's where I think statues such as Coulson should be and where they belong. And obviously, you know, we are not trying to erase history. We're making history. And obviously it started in Bristol, and obviously it's taken a snowball effect from there. Sorry. Yeah, so my hope for the future with regards to the statue is that I hope, you know, Mark Quinn was very generous, and we can actually donate proceeds of the sale to charities, and charities of my choice. There's a charity called the Black Curriculum that teaches Black history in and out of schools. And also there's another charity called the Cargo Classroom, because for me, it's very important for children coming up to have, or Black children to have a sense of belonging and a sense of pride and a sense of history, and for the full story to be told. Because I'm sure if the full story had been told from the get-go, we would not be where we are today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jyn. And I want to give a special thanks to Jyn for joining us. I think it's almost 11 o'clock at night in Bristol, and so we're really honored to have you, and we appreciate you telling your story. If you don't mind sticking around just a little bit longer, I know that there are going to be a lot of questions for you from the 150 people or so who are watching this event now. I want to move to Allison Eisenberg, who is professor of history at Princeton University, where she directs the Princeton Mellon Initiative in Architecture, Urbanism, and the Humanities. She is currently completing Uprisings, a book about the aftermath of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination, which takes Trenton, New Jersey as its starting point. She is the author of Designing San Francisco, Art, Land, and Urban Renewal in the City by the Bay, which received the 2018 Prose Award for Architecture and Urban Planning from the Association of American Publishers and from the Foundation for Landscape Studies. Her first book, Downtown America, History of the Place and People Who Made It, 2004, received awards in preservation, planning, history, and the public humanities. Today, her talk is entitled, Where Public Humanities Meet Design, What's Next for Statues and Public Space?
So thank you so much, Philip and Tempest, and to everyone who organized this. I'm just thrilled to be a part of the discussion. I'd like to bring in a couple of questions that are rooted in my historical research in the 1960s, but are fundamentally forward-facing, to bring out this question that a lot of people have asked of what's next for statues and monuments. And essentially, as this older generation of mostly representational statues come down, will they be replaced, one for one? We've seen like the public, the reinvention of the spaces around these statues. And so just to like turn the conversation a little bit to what role people in universities who do historical social science research into race, gender, protest, and representation, what role do we have to play in these, kind of forward, future-facing decisions about what we're calling monuments? And so here I would draw a distinction between essentially a community-engaged and participatory research that's often rooted in universities and often courses, with published scholarship that may or may not have local roots. I'm going to focus on the former, on the kind of community engaged scholarship, but I obviously think that the latter is incredibly important, that you can pull a book off the shelf that does a really deep dive into a particular statue or sculpture, and it is like very, very pressing and helpful. But in the interest of time, I'll focus on the community engaged. So in particular, I'm going to take up the question of where the public humanities meets design in this realm of representation and memorializing in public spaces. So by design is just kind of a shorthand for the built world, the space that we live in and that we share publicly, and that so many of the images that have already been projected like really bring to life. So I figured I wouldn't need to show some of these reference points that are in our minds, and I'm glad that I didn't, because we already have so much to work with. So I'll focus on what I would just call these experimental interpretive projects for public space that focus on race and protest. And my intention is to de-center the question of statues. So I'm drawing on this book that I'm writing about the aftermath of Reverend King's assassination with Trenton as the case study. I also want to note that I'm collaborating with a filmmaker, Purcell Carson, who also teaches, we've co-taught together on a documentary film. And there's also a seminar that I've co-taught with a playwright, Aaron Lansman. And so these are the reference points and the kind of university collaborators. So I'm just going to start with the screen share, and so I'd like to just introduce in 2 moments essentially what the story is in 1968, and I think it's already so interesting to me how many of the presenters have talked about the 60s. So essentially, in about 5 days after Reverend King was assassinated, Trenton, New Jersey was one of the cities that experienced an uprising. And here you see the newspaper focus. This is the Trentonian. The youth is killed during the outbreak. And so this young man who was labeled a looter by the white police officer who shot him in the back, Harlan Bruce Joseph was the name of this young man who's a college student. He very quickly became the center of my research. And you can see from the news coverage the way that the looting was portrayed, and that was then kind of cast over him as an explanation for why he was shot in downtown Trenton. I'm obviously not going to be able to tell the actual story here, but I just want to draw your attention to the beginnings of an inkling in the Trenton Evening Times. If you look at the lower story, youth 19 who was killed was active in city teen councils. And so it begins to bring out the fact that there was already the recognition that even though the police called him a looter, that he was regarded as a peacekeeper. He was on the mayor's youth council, and he was very involved in Trenton's civic life, even as a college student at Lincoln University. So here's a closer photo of Harlan Bruce Joseph, who was killed that day. It turned out when I dug into his story that coincidentally, from my point of view, he was also in one of the first Upward Bound summer programs, which took place at Princeton University in the summer of 1964. And he is in the center of the photo, the kind of upper center person featured in this Princeton Alumni Weekly story. And so what I'm going to take you through here are essentially a series very quickly of documentary films, student projects, research workshops, filmed interviews, performance walks, public events, and finally landscape architecture, just to kind of throw out there some of the ways that the public humanities outreach here is, you know, part of my point is that it's a very like ongoing, long-term thing. And so when a thing like this is on the ground with so many different kind of dimensions, that when people start to pull down statues and ask, you know, what should go into the place there, you know, a project like this is kind of ready and waiting, is part of my larger point. So just to show you a few images, this is just a gesture to the student micro documentaries that they made that were screened at a arts venue in Trenton, Artworks, just to kind of give you a sense of the engagement, the participation, all the people who are interviewed who come to these screenings. We ran a whole raft of different summer research workshops with students. This is just a gesture to all of the support that we had from the university, from different programs to bring the students, and not only Princeton students. We brought students from Rutgers and Montclair State who showed interest in these projects. Here's a workshop that we did to find out what Mercer Street Friends Center, where Harlan Joseph was very involved, what kind of old materials did they have? Because they didn't have an archive. So we literally climbed up into the attic. This I call box one, which was in the basement. And then the students went through the materials and we started to catalog what they had. One of the first finds was a letter from April 11th, which was 2 days after Harlan Joseph was shot, which is from the director of Mercer Street Friends, telling the newspaper to stop calling him a looter, that he had, and it was a little bit more background, but this was just a fantastic find. The fire department records were incredibly important. It's an incredible archive that basically nobody has ever used. The interviews with family, this is his older brother, Oscar Joseph. We went, for example, this is a filming at we went to 3 years of the 1960s 50-year Trenton High School reunion to interview people. The performance walks, this was a collaboration that we piloted essentially through a summer project, but then Aaron Lansman and I turned it into a course where the students did historical research. And as you saw, there was a lot of ties between Trenton and Princeton. So these performance walks were rooted in the students' original research, but they're creative scripts. And so there's this differentiation you have to make, and the students wrote these creative scripts and took about 250 people, through campus this weekend. In this case, like really bringing out the story of that summer of 1964 and what the students experienced. I would just point out that Harlan Joseph's younger sister, Sharon, is in the center of this photo. She was able to come because, in fact, she was here in New Jersey for her 50th high school reunion. Public events, this was a public screening and conversation. A Trenton Project remembers on the 50th anniversary of the uprisings. Now I just want to shift to think for a moment about the kinds of memorializations that are actually already embedded sometimes in the research that we do. So in this case, I'm just going to show you 3 little examples from his family that leave guidance for us, I think, in terms of like what kind of memorialization is appropriate. And here, the quote from them is just worth reading for a moment. This is just several days after he had been shot, and it's an open letter in the newspaper. We are hopeful that our mutual concern over the untimely demise of Bruce will serve as a unifying force dedicated to the establishment of an environment of peace, love, and opportunity. There could be no better memorial to a young man than people working for his contemporaries and those who follow to create a city where they can grow to maturity, a city in which people are unified and dedicated to equality of opportunity. So there's a lot in there to work with, of what a so-called like living memorial would be from the family. Similarly, this is from Mercer Street Friends a year later, where they labeled what they called an action memorial, where it's in the little clipping on the right, which is excerpted from the left. But it's about the idea that dedicating to action is part of what a memorial is to a person like Harlan Bruce Joseph. And they pull out some of his words. You've got to push ideas instead of people. He had these very pithy phrases that to draw on. And then there were things like scholarship funds that became deactivated over time. And finally, his mother, who's shown on the left in a newspaper story, You know, this is 15 years later, but through the rest of her life and up to the present, you know, she emphasized that people talked about doing something, but it had never happened. So here she describes a plant that she brought to the altar of the church, and she said it was in his remembrance. I'd like to see something in his name, a little park or stone somewhere, something I could walk by and say that's for him. And he was very active in youth recreation programs, so the idea of parks were especially relevant. And so this is where you leap to the current climate, right? I had always hoped that we would be able to do something, you know, in this vein that his mother had sketched out. But then this was just from last month, the kind of letter that comes out of the blue because of what is going on with the statues coming down. So an architect wrote to me who said he wanted to find out, because the Christopher Columbus statue in Columbus Park, which was the neighborhood in Trenton in the 1960s where people of color were described as not ever welcome. So the fact that it's Columbus Park has a relevance that people don't, this letter writer doesn't necessarily seem to be aware of. But he's wondering about a proposed statue of Mr. Joseph at the former site of the Columbus statue in Columbus Park. It was removed this morning, and I'd like to push the city to replace it with something more fitting for this moment. And I won't weigh in on whether it's a good or a bad idea, but it does raise the question of, like, what are the places in a story that matter? So here, for example, is the street, Carroll Street, where he lived. It's just a block from City Hall, where he was shot. So he was shot basically from the place that where I took this photo from, looking at City Hall. You know, he was on the Mayor's Youth Council. We can't really see it, it's right behind the bus stop, but there's a police memorial to fallen police officers is right there in a little kind of like headstone style monument. So this is a little bit of the actual place that he had traced. So this would be an example. This takes us to that question of landscape architecture and design. So in collaboration with the Rescue Mission of Trenton, which is actually located on Carroll Street, where Bruce grew up and actually where one of his sisters still lived, they were working with an architect to create what they first called a memorial. But once we began to work with them and bring out all of the research, they changed it to the idea of a peace park, which is, again, from, you know, that family letter, you know, love, peace, and opportunity. And with the rescue mission, what they essentially need is a place where the unhoused population can spend time outdoors during the day. And so it's a really brilliant design. I don't, you know, have permission to show it to you, but they use his words, which I think is very interesting. So it's kind of a move. It's not an abstraction versus representational, but they use his words, which are those quotes, the very few quotes we have from him just happen to be extremely inspirational and encouraging. And they weave that into this very practical park. So I put the architect from Trenton in contact with the rescue mission and the other landscape architectural firm. And I said, you should talk, because money needs to be raised, land needs to be shifted. You know, maybe this is the moment where this kind of thing can happen. So I just want to, you know, basically end on that note. I think, you know, one of the main points is that kind of long-term involvement. The other question is, you know, the kind of the place and the space in which these stories are told, and the many different kinds of ideas that people have already put out there. And this is just a tiny little sampling from a city that people don't, in fact, know very much about. But I think that the window that it opens on how the public humanities work itself, the student projects, hopefully the film and the book, you know, themselves are capable of, providing new frameworks and grappling with the past in ways that the collaborative projects can be a force of change. And I guess that's the point I would leave you with.
Thank you so much for that. I know we're gonna have a lot of questions. People are thinking about how to reimagine public space in ways that don't just center statues and monuments. So I think this is really interesting. Now we'll turn to museums. Alvia Wardlaw is a teacher and museum creator, nationally recognized in the classroom and in the showroom. She's also a leading expert on African-American art and history. Her photographs are exhibited throughout Texas. She conducts research on African-American folk art, African-American art and postmodernism, and is the recipient of numerous awards. She's a Fulbright Fellow, Compton Danforth Fellow, Ford Foundation Fellow, recognized by the American Association for State and Local History for her museum exhibit, Homecoming, African-American Family History in Georgia. The title of her talk is Dismantling Southern Mythology, Museums and Monuments.
Thank you, Philip, and thank you, Tempest. I have to say how much I'm enjoying the presentations thus far, and I'm delighted to hear this wonderful exchange. Throughout the 20th century, a particular Southern mythology has promoted the false narrative of an empowered white landed gentry who bravely maintained a white supremacist societal construct contrasted against the reality of slavery and violence towards Black and brown people in the Americas. The 1915 film Birth of a Nation promoted widely the concept of the Ku Klux Klan as a heroic group of white civilians intent on preserving their notion of a ruling white class while subjugating Blacks to terrorism, segregation, and mob violence. In the film, Black men played by white men are vilified, stereotyped, and dehumanized, and regarded as threats to the purity of white women. Similarly, the film Gone with the Wind, adapted from the Margaret Mitchell novel, projects an idyllic South, languid plantation days where young white heroines while away their days with flirtations and social gatherings, while their every need or whim is tended to by Black slave women in the big house. The hundreds of monuments which have been erected throughout the South and beyond have silently perpetuated the toxic mythology through their presence as the righteous conquerors in public spaces. Now, during this moment of global solidarity against violence toward Black and brown people, these monuments are being removed and often destroyed. In New Orleans, the statue of Robert E. Lee has been removed from Lee Circle, and in the image shown, the response to the Equestrian monument of Lee is adamant protest and the narrative pushback of graffiti. In Decatur, Georgia, an obelisk dedicated to the so-called lost cause, the Southern battle in the Civil War, is removed at night from the city's public square. On the other side of the Atlantic in the UK, a representation of Robert Milligan, a known slave trader, is toppled. Within this moment of cultural reckoning, the museums of the world must play a significant role in determining how to assess these monuments, reflective of a deeply flawed past. Should they be destroyed, warehoused, or recontextualized? Soon to be removed from its permanent location at the entrance to the American Museum of Natural History, the equestrian statue of Theodore Roosevelt, flanked by a Native American male and an African male, both carrying rifles, suggests the domination of Roosevelt, i.e. white colonial expansion, over world cultures, i.e. the other. The museum has not determined a date for removal of the monument, and this conversation has been going on for decades and was made more imperative by the death of George Floyd and the protests that followed. Nor has it been determined as to how the work will be stored or placed elsewhere. It is known, however, that public discussions will be central to this process. One of the most effective contextualizations of Southern leaders is the interpretation of the privileged life and power of Thomas Jefferson at the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture. Recognized for his role and leadership in crafting the Constitution, Jefferson is depicted classically in a bronze likeness, while behind him are stacked replicas of gold bricks representing the wealth acquired by Jefferson due to the extensive labor of the slaves that he owned and whose names are inscribed on each of these gold bars. At the newly established Civil Rights Museum in Montgomery, Alabama, names of lynch victims are recognized on wooden panels, which document county by county the countless who preceded George Floyd and Breonna Taylor in violent death by lynching. In Houston, 2 museums have responded to this seismic shift in different ways. The city's Black mayor, Sylvester Turner, ordered 2 Confederate monuments removed from public parks and relocated to other sites or to local museums. This allegorical statue, the spirit of the Confederacy, was accepted by the Houston Museum of African American Culture, to the initial dismay and anger of many Black leaders in the city. John Guest, the director of HMAC, explained that he felt that the sculpture would generate important conversation between visitors to the museum and would force important re-examination of Texas history as a slave state. Support for Guest's position is widening, and basically the Black community has a, well, let's see what happens attitude toward this. In response to the urgent activism moving across the country, the Contemporary Arts Museum in Houston commissioned Black artist and native Houstonian Nathaniel Donay, who is an MFA candidate at Yale in fine arts. He was commissioned to create a work exploring the Black community at this moment. On the south fence surrounding a construction site, Donay simply installs the graphics 3rd, 4th, and 5th, representing the Black communities of 3rd, 4th, and 5th wards. It is 3rd ward where George Floyd grew up and where I continue to live. On the west side fence around the camp, Donay installs a banner with a mashup of Black terms, language, he says, known only to the communities in which these terms thrive. The horizontal band of text is flanked by an array of backpacks donated by middle school students from the 3 wards. At night, messages are conveyed through blinking lights inside the backpacks. Programmed to Morse code, the artist conveys 3 messages: Black Lives Matter, followed by a line of prose by James Baldwin, and the first line of a lyric by Solange. This temporary installation is one way that museums can respond to today's moment of truth. Museums must be places in which all can freely discuss our truth, including the painful history behind these monuments. Deciding how to move forward with the fate of these relics of a distorted mythology will be ongoing. Museums must step out of their identity of being a neutral and precious space and be fully involved in these decisions. If all monuments are destroyed, we face the danger of disappearing the misdeeds of the past. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Warlaw. Museums are obviously a really important part of this conversation, and we're grateful for that perspective. Now we're going to move to a transnational perspective by hearing from Ana Lucia Araujo, Professor Araujo's work explores the history, memory, and heritage of slavery in the Atlantic world. She is the author of 7 single-authored books, including Slavery in the Age of Memory, Engaging the Past, and Reparations for Slavery and the Slave Trade, a Transnational and Comparative History. Her work is transnational and comparative. She's conducted archival research and fieldwork in Brazil, the United States, France, England, Belgium, Portugal, and West Africa, especially in Benin. She is a member of the International Scientific Committee of UNESCO Slave Route Project. The title of her talk today is The Death of Pro-Slavery Monuments in the US and Brazil.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Okay, then good evening, everyone, and thank you for having me. Perhaps, as you know, Brazil and the United States were the largest slave societies in the Americas. And in the era of the Atlantic slave trade, Brazil imported nearly 5 million enslaved Africans, whereas the United States imported about 300,000 enslaved persons. Both the United States and Brazil have dealt then with periods in which symbols of the past were attacked. Then slavery was abolished in the United States in 1865, and in Brazil it was abolished more than 3 decades later in 1888. Then Brazil, like other countries of Latin America, did not witness legal segregation as the United States did, but racism, of course, was and still is then everywhere in Brazil, then existed, of course, during the 20th century and have many similarities with the United States. In the United States, Black social actors and their allies have been protesting the existence of Confederate statues celebrating then white men who lost the Civil War that was fought to protect slavery, and they have been protesting for several decades. Brazil, of course, did not experience any civil war to end the slavery. It was the last country to abolish slavery in the Americas in 1888. Therefore, the country also did not witness an upsurge of monuments commemorating pro-slavery individuals as it happened here in the United States during Jim Crow. Yet, from the end of the 19th century throughout the 20th century, cities and states in Brazil unveiled monuments honoring white men who were slave owners or who were associated with the slave trade. Then, like any former slave societies, the public space of Brazilian cities and also in rural areas, they preserve sites and monuments commemorating slave owners and slave merchants. Like elsewhere, however, these markers, they go sometimes unnoticed by many residents. At the same time, sites associated with slavery, such as cemeteries, wharfs, slave markets, where enslaved Africans were, for example, disembarked, they were gradually erased from the public space. Then during the 20th century, however, the situation in the case of Brazil is a little bit different from the United States because we had several dictatorships in Brazil. And the bloodiest one was the civil military dictatorship that lasted between 1964 and 1985. During the period of the Cold War, and this dictatorship was largely supported by the government of the United States and was a dictatorship that violently silenced Brazilian activists and Brazilian Black activists. Put it differently then, during this period of more than 20 years, it was impossible for Afro-Brazilians to publicly denounce racism and even less protesting the scarce presence of markers honoring these pro-slavery individuals. But in 1985, when the military dictatorship ended, Afro-Brazilian activists were driven to denounce then racism and also calling for affirmative action. Then instead of demanding the removal of existing pro-slavery monuments or highlighting heritage sites associated with slavery, by then, Black Brazilians were rather invested in creating, for example, commemoration activities, a National Black Consciousness Day that indeed was created. Then since 1995, November 20, that is the date of the death of a man called Zumbi, the leader of the Quilombo of Palmares, then a 17th century runaway slave community that lasted, it was the largest and the long-lasting runaway slave community that you had in Brazil. Zumbi was killed in 1695, and then 1995, this date became widespread, and today hundreds of cities in Brazil commemorate Zumbi's anniversary. Then we have squares, schools, streets, all named after Zumbi, and many statues indeed were also unveiled around the country to celebrate Zumbi. Then despite these commonalities, there are differences in the ways that the United States and Brazil memorialize slavery and the Atlantic slave trade. The two countries also, they differ in how they coped with this painful past in the public space. In the last years, in the wake of Black Lives Matter movement, then in the United States, there have been several calls to either remove from the public space or to contextualize Confederate monuments and symbols. This happened also for when you are talking about Coulson in Britain, Robert Milligan in London as well. And these calls were not heard. Then in June 2020, after a white police officer murdered George Floyd, protests took over the streets of the United States and also streets around the world. And protesters had then to face once again the presence of these statues celebrating a past of slavery and paying homage again to these notorious racists and white supremacists. Then it's not surprising that demonstrators attacked these symbols, as they are reminders then of how white supremacy shaped the public spaces of American and European cities. Then what is happening now is not totally new. Before the current demonstrations started, there were a number of Confederate monuments that were topped down or removed by the municipalities. Also, public debates about these monuments have been around for several years and even decades, we can say. For a long period as well, African Americans then were forced to remain silent about pro-slavery public markers, even if we know that in a number of places, there was, of course, opposition to these monuments. What I have been arguing then in my work, either when examining Brazil or the United States or cases in France and England, my point is that when individuals racialized as Blacks debate Atlantic slavery today, either by demanding the removal or the contextualization then of monuments paying homage to white men who defended slavery and segregation, these men and women, they are not only arguing about events that happened in the past, they are engaging then with present day legacies of this past. They are debating slavery to bring to light that countries like the United States and Brazil were built on the wealth generated, created by the Atlantic slave trade and slavery. Then they are indeed engaging with their present day social and economic exclusion in making then stance against racial violence, racism, white supremacy and this deep violence that victimizes then Black men, women, and children, either in Ferguson, Rio de Janeiro, New York, Salvador, Baltimore, or also Recife in Brazil. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Araujo, for helping us contextualize this movement outside of the United States. I imagine there'll be a lot of questions. Speaking of questions, feel free to go ahead and leave your question using the Q&A function. If you're joining us via Zoom, we'll address your questions at the end on the Q&A function. You can go ahead and leave them there now. If you're joining us via the simulcast on Facebook Live, leave us your questions in the comments section, and we'll get to those at the end of the event as well. Heather Russell is Professor of Literature and is the Senior Associate Dean of the School of Environment, Arts, and Society in the College of Arts, Sciences, and Education at Florida International University, where she's taught since 2003. Her book, Legba's Crossing, Narratology in the African Atlantic, is part of a general body of scholarship on Black modernity. She is co-editor of a second book, a collection of essays focused on Barbadian singer Rihanna, and has published in numerous journals on a wide array of subjects related to African-American and Afro-Caribbean scholarly concerns. She's currently working on a book entitled Black and White TV, Independence, Popular Culture, and Globalization in the Anglophone Caribbean. And the title of her talk today is Monumental Capitalism in the Caribbean and Beyond.
Thanks so much, Philip. Let me just share my screen real quick. Okay, great. So I just wanted to start by extending a special note of gratitude to Philip on behalf of Dean House and the entire college leadership for your vision, particularly at this time when humanistic inquiry is so critically needed. Touristic travel to the Caribbean is conventionally for sea, sun, sand. There's no Louvre, Leaning Tower of Pisa, Sistine Chapel, drawing, albeit pre-COVID, throngs of tourists with cameras, Crocs, and sun visors. Indeed, in many ways, the Caribbean and its history is both construed, engaged, and consumed as the antithesis to monumentalism. As one of my students once put it, Dr. Russell, when I go to Jamaica for vacation, I don't want to think. But as the great Miles Davis reminds us, there is a world between the notes. I want to suggest, therefore, that the Caribbean is actually suffused with monuments. Monuments to the African Holocaust, to genocide, indenture, colonialism, to the systemic and systematic extraction of wealth from the region, grounded in and legitimized by racism. In other words, thinking the idea of monuments a different way, just for a moment, I want to suggest that the Caribbean is a study in the monumentalism of what the political scientist Cedric Robinson has termed racial capitalism. The challenge here, of course, is how to wrap one's head and heart around this idea. How do you monumentalize that which does not conform with our conventional notions of monuments? In other words, how might we think monuments Caribbean style? The poet laureate Derek Walcott gives us some guidance here. In the Sea is history in response to the speaker's query, where are your monuments, battles, martyrs? The narrator responds, the sea has locked them up. The interlocutor continues, but where is your Renaissance? To which the speaker replies, sir, it is locked in them sea sands. Strap on your goggles, I'll guide you there myself. It's all subtle and submarine. How then to excavate a subtle and submarine history? Thinking with Walcott in the short time for comments, I would like for you to strap on your goggles with me, just for a bit, as we work to read monumental racial capitalism as emblematic of the kind of critical historical work we might do, even as we are doing the very urgent work of physically toppling, restaging, and erecting commemorative monuments to give the lie to racism and eradicate white supremacy. I grew up in a community in Kingston, Jamaica, that was called Trafalgar Park. The road into the community was named Lord Nelson Way, and I lived on Samaras Avenue. As many of us on this Zoom call, many of my interlocutors here, we grew up surrounded by the uninterrogated legacies of empire and conquest on street names and buildings. More subtle and submarine, however, is the history they belie, a history outlined in Mimi Scheller's amazing work, Consuming the Caribbean. Here, Scheller recounts the history of Sir Hans Sloane, the renowned 18th century scientist, medical doctor, collector, chronicler, and cataloger of more than 71,000 objects over his lifetime. Plants, farming methods, trees, insects, birds, all from his research in the Caribbean. Sloane also brought back human specimens, cataloged as, quote, the fetus of a Negro, the skin of the hand of a Black. For over 15 months in Jamaica, Sloane collected and classified plants for use in researching medicines, including quinine used to treat malaria, which of course was extracted from tree bark. He learned about this, of course, from indigenous Peruvians. While in Jamaica, he observed Black women mixing cocoa, milk, and sugar, which they fed to sickly children. Sloane takes this recipe back to England, and voila, Sir Hans milk chocolate is being mass-produced for British consumption. The recipe is eventually purchased by Cadbury in 1849. For hundreds of years, Sloane and others like him depended on, extracted, and built great wealth on the intellectual property of indigenous people and enslaved Africans, what today some might term biopiracy. From chocolate to medical botany and pharmaceutical research, Sloane's achievements are only made possible by the consumptive practices of racial capitalism. The monuments to science and innovation of those upon whom such knowledge rests is hidden on the rubbish heaps of history. It is all subtle and submarine. Two more illustrative examples. So let's talk about banks. Reading Peter James Hudson's work in this moment made me think about how we might read Caribbean spaces more broadly, how banks as monuments to capitalism are suffused with the history of race, colonialism, and imperialism. Hudson argues, for example, that from the late 19th century through the first decades of the 20th century, the US banking system was engaged in a direct campaign of foreign expansion into the Caribbean and Latin America, experimenting with issuing sovereign debt, financing international trade, reorganizing regional banks and currency systems, experiments which were largely unsuccessful and rife with mistakes and missteps. So that many of these countries enter the 20th century with increasingly fragile banking and economic systems and spiraling debt, all of which would work over the subsequent decades to thwart any movement towards economic sustainability and political sovereignty. As exemplar, the US officially begins its 19-year military occupation of Haiti in 1915. 1 year before, US Marines had raided and stolen Haiti's gold reserves and turned it over to the First National City Bank in New York, an entity we today know as Citibank Corp. Economic occupation coincides with military occupation and training to produce decades-long despotic leadership in Haiti and the Dominican Republic, whose crimes against humanity remain unpaid. All the while, the Caribbean region is perpetually framed in the discourses of failed statehood, the quintessential banana republic. Hilary Beckel's Black Debt, Britain's Black Debt, is a tour de force, which makes the unequivocal case for reparations for slavery. In painstaking detail, Beckles outlines the massive accumulation of wealth in Europe, banking, insurance, trading companies, all of the markers of, or monuments, if you will, to modern capitalism. Bristol is certainly emblematic of all of this. But he goes further. Beckles' book provides details of the 20 million pounds which had been brokered in the British Parliament in 1833 in exchange for the emancipation of enchained Africans in the British West Indies, whose total cost was valued at 46 million. If you're curious about where the other 26 million came from, I'm happy to discuss that in the Q&A if we have time or there's interest. The 20 million pounds that was paid, however, to compensate for their loss of property was paid to some 3,000 families that owned enslaved Africans in the British West Indies, clergy, parliamentarians, British royalty. This represented a staggering 40% of the Treasury's annual spending budget and is estimated in today's terms to be about 20 billion pounds. The government took out a loan to pay it. That loan was paid using British taxpayers' money. The final payment was made in 2015. As Jamaica Kincaid writes in A Small Place, there was a world of something in this, but I can't go into it right now. The reparations, in 2013, the Caribbean heads of government established the CARICOM Reparations Committee to seek justice. A 10-point plan was established. Of note for today's topic is point 4, the demand that restitution be in the form of funding the establishment of cultural institutions and monuments to the legacies of genocide, enslavement, colonialism, and other crimes against humanity, and that these establishments be housed in the Caribbean where the heinous acts were committed. Thank you.
Oh gosh. Thank you, Heather. Thank you for reminding us that we're not, when we're talking about public space and we're talking about monuments and flags and statues, that it's not, even though those things are on the superficie, the surface, that it's not superficial, that this is systemic and systematic and runs really, really deep. Wallace Best is a professor at Princeton University in the departments of religion and African American studies. He specializes in 19th and 20th century African American religious history. His research and teaching focus on the areas of African American religion and literature, Pentecostalism, and womanist theology. He is author of Passionately Human, No Less Divine, Religion and Culture in Black Chicago, 1915 to 1952, and Langston's Salvation, American Religion and the Bard of Harlan. The title of his presentation today is Mama and the Confederate Flag. Professor Best, we just need you to—
There you go. Yeah, no, there you go. I was rehearsing that in my head that I would have to do that and to unmute myself, but I was thanking you, Philip, for your introduction. Thank you for allowing me to be a part of this wonderful group, and thank Tempest for getting me through some of the difficulties I had. So it's an honor to be here. And I'm going to switch in my few minutes a little bit to make it personal. I'm going to talk to you about my mama. I don't know if you can see my mama. my mama is always with me when I write. When I was finishing my latest book, my mother was right here with me. And so this piece I wrote, Mama and the Confederate Flag, is something I wrote years ago after a conversation with her. So I just want to talk to you about it. I'll never will forget the day I learned that my mother, and who was a woman of modest education from rural Goldsboro, North Carolina, had never seen the Confederate flag. This was in 2000, and the debate about the role of the flag in American life had resurfaced with new energy, with much the same way that it has again now, 20 years later. I asked her about her thoughts on the flag for a special edition of the journal Callaloo, to which I had been asked to contribute. And so when I asked my brother about the flag, I braced myself for the horror that I was sure would come. North Carolina was not Georgia, Alabama, or Mississippi, but it was still the South. And my mother could not have escaped the terror of growing up there or missed the symbols of that terror. At least that's what I thought. I could almost hear the horses' hooves of the Klan riders in the middle of the night she was going to tell me about, or see the flames of burning crosses in fields and smell the cooked flesh of Black bodies hanging from trees, or knowing that Black women lived under constant threat of sexual violence. I prepared for a story about the day some menacing white men approached her behind the barn intent on gang rape, and the way that it happened with Reese Taylor in 1944. Or at least I'd hear her recite many of the thousands of microaggressions, racialized microaggressions she endured as a domestic in white people's homes. However, instead of something definitive like the Confederate flag is bad, to my question, what do you think about the Confederate flag? I got this simple question back. What's that? So I wrote the essay after my talk with my mama and called it Mama and the Confederate Flag. Still one of my most cited pieces for some reason, and Mama would like that though. It was supposed to be about her experience with the flag, but it became an exploration of her non-experience with the flag and what that could possibly mean. And Mama was the first to speculate. Mama suggested that she had never seen the Confederate flag during her years in the South because the community in which she lived was strictly segregated and few people ever crossed the line. The only occasion she would have to see the flag, she surmised, was when someone stepped out of place, necessitating a show of force or racial dominance. And she said few people in North Carolina and Goldsboro ever did that. So in the essay, I made it all about Mama's innocence and what she wouldn't know because she had never seen the Confederate flag and didn't know what it was. She wouldn't know that there were 96 Confederate memorials to which the flag is so intricately connected in North Carolina alone. Of the over 1,700 US memorials total, most erected long after the Civil War. She wouldn't know that the flag has a history and a revised history. She wouldn't know that there is an inexorable connection between slavery, Jim Crow, the system under which she grew up. So the history of the flag in its many iterations, from the stars and bars to the more commonly known battle flag, which comes to mind when we say Confederate flag, is the stuff of typical high school, textbooks. We've all seen it. But the revised history resides perhaps more securely in the realm of public and publicly enforced memory. When the 11 states, including North Carolina, rebelled against the threat to slaveholding in the US and formed their own confederacy of states, they adopted as their symbol the Austrian-inspired, stars and bars. The revisionist history of the flag is another matter. And that's my point here. In it, there is no mention of slavery. The war was about Southern culture and heritage. It was not treason, but states' rights. And so this different level of meaning was attached to the flag, making way for the most common response given by those in support of prominent displays of the flag. And you've all heard this: it's not hate, it's heritage. Those who want to see it flying proudly over state houses and other Southern government buildings only want to honor this particular culture and heritage, they claim. Mama wouldn't know this, but that's not how that works. The Confederate flag is a symbol of treason, a relic of the past, and should have remained so in history, whether that history is revised or unrevised. But as has been mentioned, lost causes also need symbols. And those symbols are more often than not designed to inject fear, to inject hatred, and assertions of superiority rather than benign displays of culture and heritage. Indeed, I hold that there is no such thing as a benign symbol. Just as most Confederate memorials appeared on the scene long after the Civil War, public displays of the Confederate flag, the battle flag we're talking about, only began in the late 1950s and early 1960s at the height of the Civil Rights Movement, when the notion of white supremacy was at its most vulnerable. And the "it's not hate, it's heritage" claim we hear primarily from white Southerners doesn't work on another unspoken but obvious way, and that way is 58% of Blacks still live in the South. And of course, throughout the 20th century, that percentage was much higher. They too are Southerners, but they have a very different relationship to that flag. They find it offensive and terrifying for all the ways it is used to reinforce notions of white authority and superiority and Black powerlessness and inferiority. For Black Southerners, the Confederate flag is not heritage, it is hate, a symbol that can never be disentangled from America's greatest sin, from Jim Crowism, or the lie, as Eddie S. Glaude Jr. has called it in his recent book on Baldwin, Begin Again. But Mama never saw the Confederate flag during her time in the South. So I wanted to know, what could this mean? And I knew that it couldn't mean that her small town of Goldsboro was an island of racial peace, right? So there were no such places in the South during the 20th century, and Goldsboro certainly wasn't one. Rather, Mama's inclination about the absence of the flag was exactly right. The flag did not wave in her town because the work of racial dominance had been accomplished so thoroughly. Every recorded instance of racial terror involved the actual or the perception that some Black person stepped out of place, right? Few people in Goldsboro did that, as Mama said. So the specter of the flag and all the horror that it promised was a powerful means of social control. And Richard Wright said this in his novel Black Boy, the things that influenced my conduct as a Negro did not have to happen to me directly, he said. I needed but to hear of them to feel their full effects in the deepest layers of my consciousness. Indeed, the white brutality that I had not seen was a more effective control of my behavior than that which I knew. And that is the insidious nature of the Confederate flag. Its large presence throughout most of the South, even now, is meant to remind Black people of their low place in society, and that possible death awaits those who challenge the racial hierarchy. And so we want it removed, as it has been recently done from the Mississippi state flag, I think in June. So this is good, but is it enough? And I hold that it is not enough. After all the Confederate flags have been rightfully taken down and all the memorials to the slaveocracy have been removed, there must be further reckoning that confronts rather than recasts our history. We must face ourselves as we are as a country, not as we pretend ourselves to be. And it must start with what I'm thinking about as a revolution in our racial way of thinking. And concretely, an apology for slavery from the US government, which has never really happened. A real one that has a greater impact on American life and government policy, recognizing that there has never been a Negro problem in this country. The problem has always been and remains a white people's problem. Only then can we become the America that my sweet mama ultimately hoped for, one that validates something that she said to me that day about white Americans. She said, they don't want that mess now. I wish Mama was right. and perhaps one day we'll have that America. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Best, for that. I have to say, on a personal note, I grew up in North Carolina and saw those flags and did not want to put this event together without talking about the Confederate flag as a part of this conversation. And I'm really grateful to you for that. Weir Soley is a professor in the English department at FIU. She is the vice president of the Association of Caribbean Women Writers and Scholars and coordinator of the Mellon Foundation's HSI to the Pathways Hispanic Serving Institutions, Pathways to the Professorate Fellowship at FIU. She is affiliate faculty in African Diaspora Studies and Women's Studies at FIU, an Andrew W. Mellon and Woodrow Wilson Fellow. Weir Soley is author of Eroticism, Spirituality, and Resistance in Black Women's Writing, as well as 2 poetry collections, First Rain and The Woman Who Knew. I asked Professor Weir Soley if she would write a poem for this event, which you heard a little bit in the introductory video that we produced and played at the start of Monumental. And I wanted you to hear the whole thing from beginning to end as she wrote it. The poem is entitled They're Coming Down. Weir Soley is unfortunately under the weather, so she can't be with us to read the poem, but we're going to play a recording of it right now.
They're coming down. Oppress a man, oppress a woman. Cut yourself free of the rank and rancid past. Rinse your garments in the sweet new fragrance of truth, integrity, accountability, and grace. Make room for a bright and beautiful tomorrow. They're coming down, 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 these monuments to hate. These memorials of intolerance, the stars and prison bars of slavery, they're coming down in the name of freedom and equality. Let love be our shared heritage. No more 3/5 compromises. We will be 100% American, 100% free, in the name of equal rights and justice for all. If you are a big tree, I've got a small axe, ready to cut you down, ready to cut you down. They're coming down, down, down. Let love be our common heritage.
They're Coming Down by Weir Soley. We loved it so much that we used it in our video, we remixed it. Thank you so much, Aza, for that. So we have time for questions. If you would, please leave us your questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen if you're joining us via Zoom. If you're on Facebook Live, our simulcast on the Chew Facebook page, leave us your questions in the comments section under this program. I see a couple of people asking already about where we can find the event. We put all of our events on our website, humanities.fiu.edu, humanities.fiu.edu. This program will be there entirely edited in the next couple of weeks. So here's a question for you, Professor Araujo. Overall, are the citizens of Brazil outraged over the injustices toward Black and brown people, or have they, like many in the US, stopped paying attention to racism once the noise of racism dies down?
I'm muting. If we compare the United States with Brazil, here in the United States, we saw several weeks of protests, and even if most, perhaps, of the white population is not supporting these movements, we saw a number of whites supporting these movements as well. Then I think that it would be inaccurate in the context of what happened during this last summer to say that in the United States, people are not paying attention to that. But in Brazil, Yes, in Brazil, we didn't see over this. We saw some protests that emerged with when after the assassination of the murder of George Floyd occurred here in the United States. There were protests of support, but overall, it's the Black population in Brazil that takes these protests in its own hands, and we have in Brazil a white supremacist as the president of the country, who is anti-Black, anti-indigenous people, anti-women as well. I would say then that the big difference that you need to take into account is that in Brazil, more than 50% of the population is Black or brown. And then it's the majority of the population. Yet we are not seeing at this moment a massive movement, but the Black organizations, they are mobilizing, they are doing what they can, especially now during this period of the pandemic.
Thank you for that. I have a question, a big question for the whole panel, from Andrew Vasquez, who says, I wonder how there could be any ethical and just use of land, which is occupied by colonizer, lands unceded by indigenous nations and tribes. How can we decolonize our conception and use of public space? This is for anybody who wants to chime in.
That's a big question.
That is a huge question, but I think it's a brilliant one. And I'm not going to pretend to have a sort of exhaustive answer, but I do think that, you know, when we talk about sort of our politics of consumption, our consumptive practices, which I think are very sort of germane to reproducing these, you know, all of this sort of inequities that exist, and, you know, give access to one group, deny access to other groups based on, you know, histories, legacies of racism, colonialism, and the like. I think we have to strive towards an ethic of fair consumption that is guided by certain principles of free access. I think we have to be kind to each other. I think we have to be kind to the land. I think part of being ethical about the land also is really having serious conversations about food security, about sustainability, really sort of thinking about futurity, but in a very sort of broad concept. I don't believe in returns, though. I don't think there's ever a return. We can never recuperate, you know, what has happened, but I do think, and that's part of the reparative justice movement's belief, is that we can proceed with in a more ethical way, with more ethical practice and praxis, and it's a mass mobilization of sort of redistribution of you know, resources, access to education, health, all kinds of things. It's multifaceted. We have to try it, though.
I'll jump in. It is a really great question and a necessary one. And my thought is, what happens with, you know, what is the afterlife of conquest, right? What is the afterlife of the stolen land? And I immediately thought about the ways in which Indigenous communities are being disproportionately impacted by COVID, the ways in which Indigenous women and children are disappearing. There's so many ways that we are living in that right now. So that's really, you know, one of the kind of starting points. I mean, there are multiple starting points, but that I think absolutely has to be, you know, put to the forefront and of the conversation, right, about racial justice in this country. And the other piece in terms of space is really, you know, Indigenous communities, I think, people in Indigenous communities are the ones to answer that question. You know, I feel like they actually have to be the ones to say, what is it? Because you can't rebone the fish, right? But what can we do then, right? What does that look like? What is and I'm sure that people have envisioned that and it's just been silenced. And so that's where I would start.
Alan?
It's a vast question, and I think it calls to mind the reexamination of communities and those who are the original people in any one space that they have defined as part of their culture. I mean, if you just look at the real name for Mount Rushmore, for instance, that reclamation of that heritage by Native Americans, I think, is something that isn't examined enough. And all of us are, I think, aware of the fact of how broad this is and how unfairness has to be approached in terms of land identity starting in this country.
I just want to pull it back to the monuments and symbols and the visual kind of frame of all of that to that question, which is that, in any other country, if you read the history of the Civil War and you read it up to 1865 about who won and who lost, you would visit this country and you would expect to see statues all across the land dedicated to the regiments of the USCT, the United States Colored Troops, and the Medal of Honor winners of them. You would expect to see statues of Union generals that liberated southern cities and regions. You would expect to see cities of, yes, white, but white legislators like Charles Sumner or Thaddeus Stevens, right? You would expect to see those statues, and yet we don't see those statues. And I just want to note, in Richmond, there is discussion now about a monument to the USCT in order to replace one or more of those Confederate generals. And to me, that's kind of like, I see a lot of conversations about, but it should be about this larger thing, about justice. Why don't we start just with a one-to-one replacement, right? If we replace a Confederate general, let's put some of the people who actually won the war there. That would be kind of my perspective, but that's just in terms of the visual frames.
Allison?
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that conversation that I think often the discussion about public space and access to public space obliterates conversation about land, so that space is seen as this symbolic thing, this thing that people can occupy. And we actually know a lot more about the different battles over public space than we do about who actually owns land in any given place. So we could probably talk about the, battles over park or, police occupation, et cetera, but we have absolutely no idea who today owns the land in any of our individual cities. So I do think those things are a little bit in tension with each other, and we've let the public space discussion kind of hijack that other question of today, who owns land.
Any other comments for the panel on the question of land and space? That's actually a very compelling question. Thank you, Anonymous, for that. We have questions coming in from our Facebook simulcast, and I want to address a couple of those. How might removed statues be best contextualized in museums to encourage informed, constructive engagement? And how might statues that are not removed be best contextualized when left in place?
I'd like to answer. First of all, we need to have in mind that we should not take for granted that museums are willing to take all these statues, especially in the case of the Confederate monuments in the United States. We are talking about hundreds of monuments. Then we don't have places in existing museums to accommodate all these statues. Of course, there are many other possibilities to have these statues elsewhere out of the public space. The problem with the contextualization, how they can be contextualized, there were several interventions we saw in Bristol we saw in London, we saw here in the United States with the monument, for example, of Robert E. Lee in Richmond, these interventions that activists and artists, they have been doing for several years. Then people, they have been proposing or even constructing counter monuments. Then there are several alternatives, and there were also in particular cases, for example, the monument of Calhoun in Charleston, that there was a decision to keep the monument. Initially, they put a plaque, the plaque contextualized, but it was of course not enough. Then these demands for contextualizing in the case of Coulson has been there forever. Nothing was done. Then the monuments came down. There is no space anymore. You are no longer at this point, at this stage of say, let's contextualize this monument because we have a true uprising that is taking down the monuments. Then the question would be to ask to the communities, the same way that you were talking about the land of indigenous populations, what these communities they want. And this is why the case of the statue in Bristol, that the monument that Queen put in place then for 24 hours, had elements that were problematic as well, because it is not the community who decided. And of course, we have a wonderful woman activist who is the model for that monument. But the Black community or Black activists who have been fighting to take down that monument, they had no word to say. And at the end of the day, it was a white man, a white artist, who took that initiative naively, let's say spontaneously. Then I think that we need to listen a little bit, perhaps, to what the communities they have to say about what do they want, because what people want in Baltimore perhaps is not the same of what people they want in New York or in Alabama.
Yes, Professor Best.
Yeah, I want to jump in on that because I'm interested in the push to repurpose memorials inside, archives or museums, because to me, it's done in a sense that museums are neutral spaces. And that's curious to me because museums make arguments, right? I have never seen a collection in a museum that wasn't trying to make an argument about history and culture, about the past. And so I think that's the beginning point, to realize that when we want to contextualize our history, there are going to be agendas that come into play about how to do that. And I think it's right to sort of take into consideration. I like this idea of perhaps Baltimore, the discussion in Baltimore must be different from the one in Oakland, California, and so forth, and that kind of thing around the country. But I think we have to be, and this is what I've been pushing for a while now, we have to be honest about ourselves as a country. This country is so committed to its own fictions about itself. So the fictions take over whenever we try to do this kind of work. We have to pull back from all the fictions that we have created. The country is based on lies and fictions, right? So if we're going to do anything meaningful with regard to this history, we have to hit that history in its painful core. Personally, I don't see why there is a reason to memorialize a Confederate soldier. I never got that. But if we want to do that as a part of our fraught history, let's do that openly and honestly. The context is what that truly means to do that, right? Right. So, because the problem has been that, we don't memorialize as much as we celebrate these figures of oppression. And so a lot of Black folks have walked through the country. We saw it in that early clip, walking around racist architecture as if that's some kind of benign thing to do when you walk around a statue that represents everything that demeans you, right? Putting that in a museum is not going to really solve that problem, right? Then the problem becomes, how do we think about what it means to be there? So I guess what I'm calling for is something really, really difficult to do, but for the country to think honestly about the past and how we write about the past. It's difficult work, but we'll never get anywhere if we don't do it.
It's very difficult.
Yeah.
If I could just add a couple of things, you know, the idea of looking at this region by region, monument by monument, I think is very important, because it will have to involve a dialogue between the museum and those represented in that community. If that does not happen, it's all for naught. And one thing that we have to be honest about is the fact that many of our quote unquote mainstream museums they find it difficult, the staff find it difficult to have this kind of meaningful dialogue with those that surround the museum. There's a level of discomfort there. So to take this on and to really make it work will demand their being in spaces that are going to be uncomfortable for them. And it will require them to have some very difficult dialogues. That's one thing. The other point I want to make is just a pragmatic one. Not all museums are prepared to take on these huge monuments, nor will they fit in terms of what the mission statement is for those museums, but just the idea of scale. Some of these are huge monuments. How are you going to position this? I mean, that's one of the questions that is occurring now with the museum here in Houston, HMAC. This is a huge monument. Where are you going to put it? And if it's outdoors, there's a question of security. All of these are issues that are prickly and difficult and will have to be worked on. And it's not going to be done, you know, in a short period of time. But I do think that there is a place for these monuments. I understand your concern, Professor, but my fear and my caution is that if at least some of them are not retained for us to consider, you know, 50 or 100 years from now, the history will be told in a different manner because the artifacts no longer exist. So that's my argument for retaining at least some of them. But I think it's a very personal decision to be made by those who grew up around these monuments.
I 100% agree with that. And I've thought about a couple of possibilities, like having a graveyard for the monuments, you know, and also just foregrounding ritual and performance, you know, so having kind of a healing ritual around this for other people, you know, within particular communities who do, you know, walk by them every day. And then also the idea of and that's kind of what I was trying to get out of my presentation with the you know, the pedestals that remain. And I was kind of envisioning performance pieces, and we could even, you know, we auction off those people who really, you know, those statues are very close to their heart. Public monies went into purchasing or creating these statues, so let that money get returned. So people, you know, auction them off, raise money, and return it to, you know, the public coffers, or to use it to pay artists to create something else, or to, you know, do performance pieces and have it be something that's living, you know. Those are my thoughts about, I mean, there's so many ways to deal with it. And I think, again, the question of collaboration and community involvement and have it be localized are really important.
And I would say something really, really quickly, jump in there. I love your point about that, to being creative about this idea. I had never really thought about the pedestals that are left. that's an enormously wonderfully creative potential right there for it, right? To do something creative with it. I love the graveyard idea, to be honest, but but I think we also have to reckon with, and I understand your point about this, about the monuments. We can't get rid of them all, but we also have to reckon with the fact that monuments often don't tell history, right? You know, we think they are telling history. They're telling something about history. And in fact, it may be that with the absence of some of these memorials, we might have a better understanding of history with their absence. It's their presence as a historian that bothers me, because, you know, I walk around with my nieces and nephews at a monument and it says something, I'm going, oh my gosh, that's so not how that worked. And I have to, at the moment, sort of, you know, tell them that, oh yeah, that's a part of that history, but you understand that that's a particular angle of that history. So I don't trust the monuments to tell history. And so I don't think that's the purpose of talking about public monies. I don't think that was the purpose, to tell history. It was to tell a particular history, and that's different to me.
I'd much rather see that money go into a public education and really getting it right from the beginning, K through 12, all the way through universities, getting the stories told in a fleshed out, ethical way that really sort of speaks to what has been, you know, the history of race and racism in this country. And as for museums, I mean, I don't know too many museums that are operating on a, you know, with a large budget. So again, right, the need for resources, right, the need for there to be a real commitment to, you know, giving the resources that are necessary to surround whatever kind of, you know, monuments are decided upon in terms of being preserved or not to be seems pretty critical. And then going the next step towards, you know, ensuring that our pedagogy, our curriculum is very much reflective of you know, the real history of you know, the transatlantic slave trade, colonialism, and beyond.
Jyn Reed, what do you hope happens to, Jyn Reed, we have a question for you. What do you hope happens to a surge of power?
A surge of power, what I'd like to see, obviously, you know, obviously if that statue is sold, then proceeds will be going to, like I said before, the cargo classroom and the Black curriculum. Obviously, also I want to dispel the entire Black community not being happy with Mark Quinn making a sculpture of me and putting that on the plinth. Obviously, there's a sculptor called Thomas J. Price, who had a sculpture being revealed a few weeks after, of a Black woman looking down at her phone. So obviously Mark Quinn and his statue obviously kind of rained on his parade just a little bit. Now, here in Bristol, very small community within the Black community, there are the haves and there are the have-nots. And so for every person within the Black community that didn't like the fact that Mark Quinn, as a white man who came from London to Bristol, there are 10 little girls, boys, mums and dads who greet me on a daily basis to tell me and thank me for what that did for them and what that did for their children, which for me is what is very important. I didn't have that. I had nothing like that as a child growing up. I have girls, teenage girls, approaching me in the street with tears in their eyes and saying thank you for what that symbolized. What I tell them is it's not about me, it's about what that symbolizes. It's about what was there before and what was there after. And that's what I want them to have, and that's what I've given them. And that's the importance for me.
The Bristol Council ordered that statue removed. Did you have any contact with the Bristol Council or any input, or did the community have?
It's funny that the Bristol Council or the mayor couldn't make a decision about a slave master who enslaved his ancestors, but was very quick to make a decision about a Black woman being on the plinth. So that's a question for the Mayor, Marvin Rees. However, I think he will be remembered as the Black mayor who took down a statue of a Black woman in 24 hours, but was unable to make a decision about a slave master coming down. So that's his conscience that he needs to deal with.
Ms. Reed, another question for you. What's your message to protesters in the United States? If you've been watching, for instance, the photography of Alan Chin or the news stories coming out of the US, what do you have to say to protesters here?
I think those protesters should keeping on, and just any injustice, the slightest injustice, you take to the streets. You know, we're coming together as one and standing as one, and enough is enough. And that needs to be repeated constantly and to take to the streets.
Thank you. We have a question for, let's see, for Ana Lucia Araujo. I was wondering if you could expand, this is from Facebook Live. I was wondering if you could expand on Brazilian monuments erected to commemorate the indigenous slave trade and how they relate to contemporary social movements such as Black Lives Matter. For instance, I'm thinking of the Monumental às Bandeiras and the Borba Gato statue, both located in Sao Paulo City, that have been the topic of much heated public debate, especially thanks to Black activists.
First of all, I want to be honest here, because I do not work on how indigenous slavery is memorialized. Then I don't feel necessarily comfortable to comment on something that is not. But what happened in the case of Brazil is that this monument has been there since the 1960s, I believe. This is in São Paulo. It's a very ugly monument. Aesthetically speaking, it's something that is visual pollution that was put there. This was a man, Borba Gato, who chased and who hunted indigenous populations to sell them into slavery. And for some reason, this monument was put there. We don't see a movement to take down the monument, but this conversation has been especially present in social media and so on. But I think that what is more important regarding the Black Lives Matter movement is other initiatives that we are having in Brazil right now. For example, this is a shout out to my friends, activists and historians in Salvador, in Bahia. That is a city that 80% of the population there is Black. Salvador was the second largest slave port during the period of the Atlantic slave trade in Brazil. And despite the fact that we celebrate much African heritage in Bahia, nothing regarding its slavery and slave trade heritage has been done. For example, we do not identify the streets, the monuments honoring slave merchants there, the sites associated with them. And now we have a group of historians, and I don't have here the address of the website, but they are doing a wonderful job in terms of documenting these different sites, honoring these slave merchants and slave owners. And there is then this initiative to perhaps create a museum and to create markers that will identify the places where people were disembarked, sold, and so on. I think that this debate is much more important than to take down one single statue of Borba Gato, whereas we have statues honoring slave merchants in Brazil as well. Of course, not as much as in the United States or perhaps in Britain, but this memory is still there. And I think that we should be talking about that more, perhaps at the same time, at least that we are then talking about this case of Borba Gato in São Paulo.
Thank you for that. We are running over. Our events always run over. Sorry about that, but it's because they're so interesting. We have so many good questions. Let's just take a couple of final questions. Thank you, panelists, for sticking around. This question is for Professors Best, Wardlaw, and Eisenberg. How might anti-monuments, meaning monuments to the lynched and the resistors, affect public thought and public education? Any thoughts on that?
Well, I think the Civil Rights Museum in Montgomery has addressed that issue. And I have not visited the museum yet, but I think the way in which they have memorialized lynch victims has opened up that conversation in a very meaningful manner. So I would use that example as a model of how to go forth in establishing other monuments.
And I think that's a really important question. And when I traced the story in Trenton back, I traced the Great Migration story for Harlan Joseph's family to Orangeburg County, South Carolina, and a kind of like web of tiny little towns and the sending church that his family came from. And it turned out that members of his own family had been lynched, and it was this like, kind of tiny town and an overwhelming number of tragic stories. And I think it's kind of the opposite of what Professor Wardlaw just referred to. Like what would it mean to have in these tiny towns that today the population is like, 400 people, to bring out that history? I don't know the answer to that, but I managed to find a research assistant who is at the University of South Carolina, and her family is from the same town. And I asked her that question, do people know? Like, do they know this history? And she said that nobody ever talks about it. And you just scratch the newspaper stories, and it's everywhere in the turn of the 20th century. So I think that's a really important question. How would you do it? And what would it mean in such small places, which is where a lot of this terrorism occurred? How do you do that? I don't know the answer, but great question.
Alan?
Yeah, I think, by the way, thank you everybody for such a great conversation. I actually think it's really easy how you do that if you have the political will, right? If you talk to ex-Yugoslavs, no matter which side they fought on in these more recent wars, they all, by and large, share the respect for the partisans of the Second World War that defeated Hitler. You go to France and you see monuments to, the French resistance, sometimes a little airbrushed also. But, it's really simple, right? People do need heroes, I think. And, if we're going to pull these statues down of these false heroes, I don't actually think it's that hard. Like, I think in Trenton, your case there, Professor Eisenberg, of this young man that was killed, in the 60s, that's pretty simple open and shut case to me, right? Hire a sculptor, make it, put it up. And then I think especially, the smaller town, how many southern towns have we driven through where there's a little town square, and in that town square there's a monument, and they are coming down now, and nothing is replacing them. And I think what replaces them, as I said before, it shouldn't just be about some abstract idea of justice. It needs to be specifically about individuals that made a difference. Maybe more recent people like John Lewis, maybe more unknown people like your young man in Trenton, and yes, maybe like actual war heroes, liberators. That's just what I think.
I know I wasn't asked this question. I just want to jump in really quickly because this is just making me think about trauma and making me think about how it is that the folks that you mentioned, Professor Eisenberg, in that small town are, how the proximity that they have to those, the instances of racial terror and those lynchings, and how so many folks want to put that behind them, right? So what does it mean to actually say, yes, okay, let's have a monument to, your grandfather or your great uncle or, your mother in that is a reminder, a constant reminder of what has happened. And so I think that there's so many conversations that need to really happen about how to go about that kind of memorialization, because it presumes a certain distance, but then it also, there's a kind of denial of the the ongoing, ongoing realities, right, of the consequences of those murders and of the, of the trauma.
Thank you for that. We are well over time, so we're going to stop. There was a question that came in that asked why it was important for us to do this event. The reason is because we're not going to let this conversation die. We're going to keep this going. We're going to use our space in the Center for Humanities in an Urban Environment to keep the conversation going. We have events planned online for the rest of the academic year that will address this topic. It is not a one-off. It is completely baked into what we're doing in the center. And so check our website, humanities.fiu.edu, for our next events. Thank you so much to the panelists. Thank you so much to all of the viewers. We're really grateful to you. A special thanks to Jyn Reed for staying up so late from England. We're really grateful.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you for being with us.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, professors. I am going to play our opening video one more time for those people who came late. That's the end of it from our end. See you on humanities.fiu.edu.
Thank you, Philip, for all of your work.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Really, really appreciate it.
Thank you, Philip. Thank you all.
This is a coming home moment to see that down there every day out, and had to come and see that park statue in this park and be reminded of the racial hatred. It is just, it's God.
They're coming down. Oppress a man, oppress a woman. Cut yourself free of the rank and rancid past. Rinse your garments in the sweet, new fragrance of truth, integrity, accountability, and grace. Make room for a bright and beautiful tomorrow. Rinse your garments in the sweet, new fragrance of truth, integrity, accountability, and grace. Make room for a bright and beautiful tomorrow.
Following shooting, South Carolina removes the Confederate flag from the grounds of the state capitol.
If we really want to move forward, instead of adding statues of people who cause so much atrocities and celebrate them at the same time, it just